The Imperial Japanese Navy told its battleship crews they served the decisive weapon of the Pacific War. That was the institutional position, and it was embedded in everything the Navy's doctrine described as its strategic purpose. The battleship was the arbiter of naval supremacy. The battleship was the instrument through which control of the Pacific would be established, through which the decisive fleet engagement the Navy's entire operational planning assumed would determine the war's outcome would be fought and won. The men who served aboard Nagato, Yamashiro, Fuso, Ise, Hyuga, Kongo, and Haruna were told they crewed the fleet's core. They were told the ship they lived in was the reason the war would eventually be decided in Japan's favor. By the summer of 1942, the decisive fleet engagement had occurred at Midway, and the battleships had not been part of it. By the end of 1943, the battleship force was anchored at Truk, and then at Linga Roads doing nothing, while the rest of the fleet was consumed around it. By October 1944, the battleships were being sent to Leyte Gulf on a one-way mission that the naval staff privately understood would cost most of them. By the summer of 1945, the ones that remained were moored in Japanese harbors, being used as anti-aircraft platforms because they could not move for lack of fuel, waiting for an invasion that was coming, regardless of what the battleships could do about it. The institutional claim was the decisive weapon of the Pacific War. The documented reality was a fleet of enormous ships that spent most of the war at anchor, while everything the war required was accomplished by other means, and that when finally committed to battle were sunk one after another by exactly the air power that the battleship doctrine had failed to account for. The men who lived inside this gap between institutional promise and operational reality for 4 years experienced something that no other warship crew in the Pacific War quite replicated. Not the specific hell of the submarine crew sealed underwater in a shrinking air supply. Not the specific hell of the destroyer crew running the slot against overwhelming odds. The specific hell of serving aboard the world's most powerful surface warships in a war where power expressed through large caliber guns against other ships was almost never the determining factor, while being told continuously that your ship was the instrument on which the war's outcome depended, while watching the war's outcome being determined by the aircraft flying from the carriers your ship was supposed to protect, and by the submarines hunting the shipping your ship was supposed to threaten, and never being sent to do the thing the institution that built you and trained you and assigned you to this ship said you were there to do. That is a specific and particular form of hell that the historical literature has not always addressed directly, and that the men who lived through it carried in a form the post-war accounts have only partially captured. Start with the ships, because the specific physical environment of the Japanese battleships, other than Yamato and Musashi, shaped daily life for the bulk of the Imperial Navy's battleship force throughout the war. And these ships have received considerably less attention than the 2 super battleships whose spectacular losses have dominated the historical narrative. The Nagato class, consisting of Nagato and Mutsu, were the most modern pre-Yamato Japanese battleships, and the most prestigious surface warships in the Imperial fleet throughout the early war period. Nagato displaced approximately 38,000 tons at standard load, measured 220 meters from stem to stern, and carried 8 41-centimeter guns in 4 twin turrets as her main battery. These were genuine capital ship weapons, firing shells weighing approximately 1,000 kilograms to ranges exceeding 30,000 meters, capable of penetrating the armor of any warship afloat. Nagato had been the flagship of Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, the ship from whose bridge Yamamoto received the transmission reporting the attack's success. She carried throughout the early war period the institutional prestige of the fleet's flagship and the specific form of extra maintenance and ceremonial attention that flagship status imposed on a crew, alongside the general demands that operating any capital ship in wartime produced. The Fuso class, Fuso and Yamashiro, were older ships of the pre-Washington Treaty generation, modernized extensively in the 1930s, but still carrying the weight of a design conceived in a different era. They displaced approximately 39,000 tons in their modernized configuration and carried 12 35-centimeter guns in 6 twin turrets, with an arrangement that placed 2 of those turrets amidships in a configuration that created specific fire arc limitations, and that, along with their age and the subsequent availability of more modern battleships, consigned them to the secondary roles within the fleet that the naval staff reserved for ships whose capabilities were adequate, but whose priority was below the most modern units. The Issei class, Issei and Hyuga, underwent one of the more unusual transformations of any warship class in the Pacific War, having their aft twin main battery turrets removed in 1943 and replaced with a flight deck capable of operating up to 22 aircraft, creating a hybrid battleship carrier configuration that the naval staff described as fulfilling both roles and that in practice fulfilled neither adequately because the hybrid design's compromise between the two functions left the ship less capable as a carrier than purpose-built carriers and less capable as a battleship than ships that retained their full main battery. The Kongo class, 4 ships, Kongo, Haruna, Hiei, and Kirishima, were the most heavily worked battleships in the Japanese fleet, employed in roles that their speed advantage over the slower and more modern Fuso and Nagato class ships made them specifically suited for, including the shore bombardment missions against Henderson Field in October 1942, and the escort of carrier task forces that their 30-knot speed permitted. Their increased operational tempo compared to the other Japanese battleships meant that their crews experienced more sustained operational stress and more direct combat exposure than the men on the ships that spent extended periods at anchor while the war was conducted by other elements of the fleet. Of the 4 Kongo-class ships, 2 were sunk in combat relatively early in the war. Hiei was damaged by American surface forces during the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942 and subsequently sunk by American aircraft while immobilized in Iron Bottom Sound. Kirishima was sunk by the American battleship South Dakota and Washington 2 nights later, on November 14 to 15, 1942. In the only battleship versus battleship surface engagement, the Americans fought in the Pacific. Kongo was torpedoed and sunk by the American submarine USS Sea Lion in the South China Sea in November 1944. Haruna survived until July 1945, when she was sunk by American carrier aircraft while moored at Kure. Begin with the daily physical reality of serving aboard a Japanese battleship, because that reality was shaped by conditions that the Navy's institutional presentation of battleship service as prestigious and important had not described, and that the specific character of Japanese naval culture made those conditions simultaneously harder and more rigorously managed than comparable conditions on American or British capital ships. The crew of a Japanese battleship in wartime was organized under a social and institutional hierarchy that expressed itself in the physical spaces of the ship with a completeness that the American and British Navy's own hierarchies did not quite replicate. The gap between officer and enlisted man on an American battleship was real and maintained by the ship's architecture, with officer country separated from enlisted berthing by a combination of physical location and social convention. On a Japanese battleship, this gap was reinforced by a cultural framework that extended into every interaction between men of different ranks in ways that the American observer found striking in their formality and their pervasiveness, and that the enlisted men who lived within this framework experienced as a permanent feature of the environment, as inescapable as the heat in the engine rooms. Senior ratings occupied spaces that were marginally better than junior ratings, in the same ways that all naval hierarchies express rank through incrementally improved accommodation. Officers had staterooms. The captain had quarters appropriate to his status as commander of a major warship. These spaces were not luxurious by civilian standards. They were private, which on a ship carrying a crew of 1,700 men in the volume that a battleship provides was the most significant distinction available. The enlisted men's berthing, occupying the lower decks and the spaces between machinery compartments that the ship's interior volume made available after weapons, engines, ammunition, fuel, and the systems that served them had been accommodated, was organized on the hammock system that the Japanese Navy maintained throughout the war as its standard lower deck sleeping arrangement. Each man was issued a hammock and rigged it to assigned hooks on the berthing compartment's overhead when sleeping, stowed it rolled and secured during the day, and occupied the mess table that his berth assignment placed him adjacent to for eating, and for the card games and letter writing and personal maintenance that filled the off-watch hours. The hammock system worked better than no system in the specific sense that it allowed a berthing space to accommodate more men during waking hours than a fixed bunk system would have permitted in the same volume, because the hammocks were out of the way when not in use. It produced a sleeping environment that the ship's motion in any significant sea state made more uncomfortable than a fixed bunk, but that the accumulated training of men who had lived with it since joining the Navy normalized into something manageable. The men who served on Japanese battleships had almost universally spent earlier periods of their careers on destroyers or cruisers where the hammock system applied identically. So, the transition to battleship berthing represented an improvement in the quality of the spaces around the hammock rather than a change in the sleeping arrangement itself. The heat was the defining condition of life below decks on every Japanese battleship in every theater of the Pacific War, and it requires specific examination because its specific character differed by location within the ship in ways that determined different forms of what the heat meant for different crew members. The engine rooms and boiler rooms of a Japanese battleship in wartime tropical operations were the extreme case. The Fuso-class battleships carried 12 canpon boilers in 4 boiler rooms, generating steam for 4 shaft turbines, developing 75,000 shaft horsepower at full power. The boiler room temperatures during high-speed operations in tropical water exceeded 60 degrees Celsius. The specific parameters of the other Japanese battleship classes were comparable rather than identical, but the fundamental experience of standing a boiler watch in a Japanese capital ship's machinery spaces in the tropical Pacific was the same across every class. Temperatures that the body adapted to over weeks and months of exposure in ways that allowed functional performance, but that imposed a cumulative physiological cost, documented in the post-war health records of surviving engineering ratings, with a consistency that reflects exposure rather than coincidence. The upper decks and the gun turrets where the main battery crews worked were a different thermal environment from the boiler rooms, but not a comfortable one. A 41-centimeter gun turret on Nagato, in the tropical sun at anchor in Truk Lagoon, absorbed solar heat through its steel surfaces and trapped it in an enclosed space with limited ventilation, producing interior temperatures that the turret crews working to maintain the guns and the training machinery experienced as 35 to 40 degrees Celsius during the hottest part of the day. The turret was designed as a weapons system, not as a habitable space, and its thermal characteristics reflected this priority exactly. The numbers that define what Japanese battleship service actually meant across the arc of the war require careful examination here, because they reveal something that simple casualty statistics and tonnage figures do not capture: the specific distribution of operational activity that determined how the crews actually experienced their service. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, from December 1941 through May 1942, the Japanese battleship force did not fire its main batteries at enemy ships in anger on a single occasion. The Pearl Harbor attack was conducted by carrier aircraft. The invasions of the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma were conducted by amphibious forces supported by cruisers, destroyers, and carrier air power. The Indian Ocean raid of April 1942, which sent the Japanese carrier striking force to the shores of Ceylon, was not accompanied by the battleships in the attack force. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the first major carrier engagement of the war, involved no battleships on either side. The battleships spent these months at sea in various escort configurations or in port at their home anchorages, their enormous crews maintaining ships that were not being used for the purpose the ships had been built for. The drills continued, the gunnery exercises continued. The crews practiced the skills that the doctrine said would be needed when the decisive engagement arrived. The decisive engagement did not arrive in the form that the practice had been conducted for. Midway in June 1942 changed the strategic equation permanently, but not in a way that the battleship force's crews immediately understood in its full implications. The loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single day was catastrophic, but not yet obviously decisive from the perspective of a battleship sailor at Truk in the weeks following the battle. The carriers had been lost, and the naval staff was rebuilding the carrier force. The battleships were still intact and still powerful, and still the armored core of the fleet. The decisive engagement that the doctrine described was still possible, still coming, still the event toward which the fleet's preparation was directed. By the end of 1942, with the Guadalcanal campaign having consumed Hiei and Kirishima, and significant portions of the cruiser and destroyer forces in repeated surface engagements that the battleships other than the Kongo class had not been committed to, the shape of the war the battleships were actually in had become considerably clearer. The Navy was losing destroyers faster than it was building them. The carrier air groups were being attrited in the Solomons in ways that the Naval Staff's reconstruction program could not fully offset. The surface ship losses in the slot were accumulating into a pattern that the battleship's continued existence in the fleet could not reverse, because the specific operational problems the slot created for Japanese logistics were not problems that 41-centimeter guns could solve. The experience of Truk Lagoon in 1943 represents the specific form of hell that the Japanese battleship produced for its crew that has received the least historical examination, and that was, in some respects, more psychologically demanding than the combat operations that eventually destroyed most of the fleet. Truk Lagoon, in 1943, was the combined fleet's principal anchorage in the Central Pacific, a large, sheltered lagoon in the Caroline Islands, surrounded by a reef that provided excellent protection for fleet units and supported the logistical infrastructure the fleet required. Japanese battleships spent extended periods at Truk in 1943, anchored in deep water surrounded by the fleet, while the war was conducted primarily by smaller units in the waters around Guadalcanal and New Guinea, and by the land-based air forces contesting control of the island chains that both sides needed. Living aboard a Japanese battleship at Truk Lagoon in 1943 meant living in a 1,700-man crew's routine of watches, drills, maintenance, and the specific social compression of an enormous crew in the confines of a warship that was not going anywhere, performing the functions of maintenance and readiness that any warship required, regardless of whether it was being used operationally, in a climate that provided consistent heat and humidity, with limited opportunities for shore leave, in a forward base that offered minimal recreation facilities compared to the home ports the men had come from. The watch system continued, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, in the rotation that every Japanese warship maintained, regardless of whether the ship was at sea or at anchor. The watches at Truk at anchor were different in their content from watches at sea, but they were not shorter, and they were not less structured. Quarterdeck watches maintained the routine of a ship in commission. Engineering watches monitored the auxiliary machinery that kept the ship's systems functioning even when the propulsion plant was shut down. Lookout watches maintained the visual search of the lagoon and the sky above it for threats that became more real as 1943 progressed and American submarine and air activity in the Central Pacific increased. The drills at anchor and Truk were the crew's primary meaningful activity, and the specific character of those drills in 1943 was shaped by the gap between what the crews were training for and what the war was actually producing. Main battery firing exercises sent the heavy shells across practice ranges in the lagoon's open water. The enormous concussive blast of 41 or 35-centimeter guns, reminding everyone in the anchorage that these were warships of enormous destructive potential. But the training exercises were conducted against practice targets, not against the enemy fleet that the training was supposed to prepare the men to engage. And the men performing the training understood that the enemy fleet was not approaching through the waters outside Truk's reef. The kamikaze of boredom that extended anchorage at Truk, imposed on the battleship crews, was not the dramatic sudden terror of combat. It was the slow specific corrosion of morale that extended purposelessness produces in military units that have been organized and trained for a specific function, and that are not being used for that function while the war goes on around them. The men maintained their equipment, stood their watches, performed their drills, and understood with increasing clarity as 1943 progressed that the war was not developing in a direction that would eventually provide the engagement their training was preparing them for. Operation Hailstone, the American carrier strike against Truk on February 17th and 18th, 1944, ended the lagoon as a safe anchorage and forced the combined fleet's main body to withdraw to Tawi-Tawi in the Sulu archipelago, and then to the Japanese home waters. The strike caught Japanese ships at anchor in the lagoon and sank or damaged dozens of vessels, demonstrating that the Central Pacific was no longer a safe location for major fleet units, regardless of the geographic protection Truk's reef provided. The battleships that escaped the hailstone strikes escaped because they had been warned and sortied from the lagoon before the attack developed. Their escape was operationally successful and strategically meaningless because the forces that had made Truk untenable as a base were the same forces that would make every other forward anchorage untenable in turn. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. In June 1944, the engagement Japanese planners had described as their opportunity to reverse the war's trajectory with a decisive carrier battle in Central Pacific waters, committed the entire remaining Japanese carrier force, supported by the battleships in their carrier escort role, against Task Force 58. The result was the near-total destruction of the Japanese carrier air groups in the engagement American air crews called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The battleships that formed the outer ring of the Japanese formation fired their anti-aircraft batteries throughout the battle, but were unable to provide meaningful protection to the carriers from air attacks that arrived faster and in greater numbers than the battleship's anti-aircraft capability could effectively manage. After the Philippine Sea, the Japanese battleship force that remained intact was a fleet without a purpose that its own doctrine could describe coherently. The carrier air groups had been destroyed. The carriers themselves were gone or crippled. The battleship, whose entire strategic rationale had been its role in supporting the decisive fleet engagement, was now a fleet without the carrier air groups that the doctrine said were required to create the conditions for the battleship's guns to be decisive. The Naval Staff's response was Show 1, the plan for the Leyte Gulf battle, which committed the battleships in a surface attack on the American invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf, while using the remaining carriers as a decoy to draw away the American fast carrier forces. The Show 1 planning required the battleship force to transit the Surigao Strait at night, a passage through confined waters that American surface forces were positioned to defend with radar-guided gunfire and an enormous torpedo reserve from the destroyers that screened their battle line. Fuso and Yamashiro were sent through the Surigao Strait in the early morning hours of October 25, 1944. American PT boats attacked them in the hours before they reached the battle line. American destroyers attacked them with torpedoes that hit Fuso so severely that the ship subsequently exploded and broke into two pieces, each section burning separately in the strait, as Yamashiro continued forward alone into the gunfire of the American battleships, waiting at the northern end of the strait. The Battle of Surigao Strait on the night of October 24th to 25th, 1944 was, in a specific irony that the naval historians have noted repeatedly since, the last battleship versus battleship surface engagement of the Pacific War, and possibly the last in naval history. The Americans crossed the T on the approaching Japanese formation with a precision that the textbook examples of this tactical maneuver almost never achieve in actual combat. Every ship of the American battle line fired. Every battleship in the American force was a veteran of Pearl Harbor, repaired and returned to service for exactly this moment. Yamashiro, the sole surviving Japanese battleship to reach the gun line, was hit by hundreds of shells and multiple torpedoes and sank. Of her crew of approximately 1,700 men, fewer than 100 survived. One of those who did not survive was Seaman First Class Haruki Tanaka of Yamashiro from Osaka Prefecture, who had served aboard the ship since June 1943 and who was 20 years old on the night of the Surigao Strait battle. He had joined the Imperial Navy from a family that had no military tradition, the son of a textile merchant, volunteering in 1942 at 18 after two of his school friends had been conscripted and a third had been killed in the New Guinea campaign. He had been assigned to Yamashiro through the standard personnel allocation process that the Naval Bureau applied to capital ship assignments, arriving at Truk in June 1943 to serve in the ship's secondary battery division, learning the operation and maintenance of the ship's 14-centimeter guns that formed the medium-caliber armament between the main battery and the anti-aircraft weapons. He served aboard Yamashiro through the entire period at Truk, through the Tawi-Tawi anchorage, through the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Yamashiro's anti-aircraft batteries were in continuous action against American aircraft during the approach and withdrawal phases of the engagement, without the ship herself being hit. He wrote letters home to his parents throughout this period, and his family preserved 14 of them. The letters were reviewed by a Japanese naval history researcher in 1988, who located the Tanaka family through the Naval Archives casualty records and sought them out specifically because Yamashiro survivors were sufficiently rare that any documentation of her crew's experience had historical value. The researcher found the 14 letters written between June 1943 and October 1944. The last letter was dated October 19, 1944, 6 days before the Surigao Strait. It had been mailed from the ship's last port call before Showan was launched. It arrived at the Tanaka family home in Osaka 3 weeks after Yamashiro sank, while the family was still hoping for word of their son's status. The researcher's account of the letter's content, published in a Japanese naval history journal in 1989, describes their general character rather than quoting them directly. He described them as letters from a young man who was not unhappy in his service and was not afraid, at least in the terms available to him in letters that he knew would be reviewed before being delivered, but who described the accumulating months of anchorage with a specificity that made the boredom and the purposelessness legible between the lines of what he was permitted to write. The researcher noted that the letters from the Truk period described the lagoon's appearance at different times of day, the color of the water in the morning and in the afternoon, the way the other ships looked in the anchorage, the specific sound the guns made during practice firing, with a quality of attentive observation that he read as a man filling time by looking very carefully at the world immediately available to him, because the world beyond the lagoon was not available and there was nothing else to do. The last letter, written 6 days before the Surigao Strait, mentioned that the ship was at sea again, and that he thought the situation was serious. He did not say more than that. The letter said he hoped his family was well, and that his younger sister was still doing well in school. He said he had been thinking about the textile district in Osaka in the mornings, and that when he thought about it, he could smell the specific smell of dyed cloth drying in the morning air, which he associated with his childhood, without being able to explain why the memory kept returning. The researcher noted that this was the letter's last paragraph. He noted that Tanaka had not concluded with any explicit statement about what might happen. He noted that the researcher had asked Tanaka's mother, who was still living in 1988, whether she had understood the letter as a farewell when it arrived. She said she had understood it when she read it and had not been able to put it down for a long time. She had kept all 14 letters in the original envelopes. She showed them to the researcher and declined to have them reproduced, but permitted him to describe their contents. She said she had read them many times over the decades. She said the ones from Truk she found the hardest, not because anything bad happened in those letters, but because nothing happened in them at all, and she thought that was the part of his service she had never been able to fully imagine. She said it was easier to imagine the night he died than the year he spent waiting. Did anyone in your family serve in the Japanese Imperial Navy or in any fleet of the Pacific War? Drop their name in the comments. Let's make sure they are remembered.